Good evening, everybody. We were just giving everyone a few minutes to get logged in. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I really want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for people right now, and I want to thank everyone for giving their time this evening to be here with us. My name is Alicia Hunt. I am the Acting Director of Community Development for the City of Medford. One of the things that the city is working on right now is a housing production plan. That's the formal name, but what it actually is an affordable housing production plan. The goal of a plan like this is to guide the city in the best way to incorporate more affordable housing into the city of Medford. I'd like to just introduce with us this evening, we have Danielle Evans, who is also staff in the Office of Community Development. She is managing this plan for us, and the consultants who are working on the plan with us are Callahan and Jenn Goldson of JM Goldson. And now I'm going to turn this meeting over to Jenn to present.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'm Jenn Goldson. I'm really happy to be here. Why don't you write to us in the chat just to make sure you can see my video here, as well as I'm sure you can see the screen, but just let me know if you're having any trouble. Okay, great, good, thank you. Good. So we're here to really talk about a project that we're working on with the city to prepare a housing production plan. And this is really the first public meeting, this webinar. We would have normally done this in person, but we were glad to have the technology at least so that we could reach all of you this way. And we're going to go over some of the basics of what a housing production plan was, why communities do them, and then go over some of the initial findings from the analysis, and then sort of conclude with ways that you can get involved and share your thoughts and provide comments. And I'm going to apologize in advance if you, as we all are working from home right now, if you hear like rock and roll music in the background or any yelling and door slamming, it's my teenage daughters. I'm one floor above them right now. So hopefully that will give you a little chuckle, and my partner's gonna manage them as best as he can. All right, so let's start actually by finding out a little bit more about you all. Hopefully you can, I'm launching a poll, so hopefully you can see that. Somebody write in the chat just if you can see this poll. It says, which neighborhood best describes where you live? Great. Okay, good. So go ahead and take that. And if you don't live here or you don't recognize one of these neighborhoods as your own, then you can just skip this question. All right, so it looks like I have about 9 of you voting. That's okay, about 10 out of 14 now. Great, does anybody need another minute? I'm watching the chat if you do. Okay, great. So it looks like, let me share the results of that. Hopefully you can see the results now. So it looks like, you know, most of you, 3, live in South Medford, and then we have some in Hillside, Glenwood, and 1 in Lawrence, 1 in Haynes Square, Stevens Square. Great. Okay, good. So I wanted to take a moment to really recognize the timeliness of this plan. In some ways, it might feel weird to do you know, a 5-year plan, sort of a longer range type of planning exercise in the middle of a pandemic and all of the social unrest that our country is experiencing right now. We're facing economic insecurity, housing instability, and there's lots of things on everybody's plates. And as Alicia had, you know, mentioned, we just really appreciate you taking the time out and that you are here. I also wanted to acknowledge that just yesterday, your mayor, chief of police, superintendent of schools, and the city's director of equity inclusion posted this statement. And one of the things that's, if you haven't seen it, it's on your city website. One of the things it says is it acknowledges that the protests, both peaceful and not, are the result of decades of systemic racism against persons of color that create barriers to equal opportunities and make persons of color targets of atrocious acts of violence. This is a pivotal moment in our nation's history. How we respond, and the captions are going over it. How we respond will determine how quickly we can begin to heal and unite. And those words are very powerful. It goes on. So if you haven't read that statement, I encourage you to read the rest of it. So I just wanted to take a step back and think about what it means to have a pivotal moment in a time when you're actually preparing a housing plan. It's a plan about development, a plan about the people in your community. And so I would encourage us to think of this time as not just a time to react to the crises that are at hand and so at the forefront of our mind, but really a moment also to reassess. As a community planner, I take very seriously the history that planning has had in creating environments that perpetuate the inequities that we see in our society. And planning can also, though, be used to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that this housing plan, the fact that you're doing this right now, is an opportunity for you because the community's awareness is so heightened. Really, our whole country's awareness is so heightened of the inequities in the country. So I think that this housing plan, the fact that you're doing this now and that you're really doing public engagement around it right now, provides the community a chance to reassess and to clarify what your goals are moving forward. So what a housing production plan does, it's different than any other kind of housing plan. You may have a housing element of a master plan that looks at your whole community. You may have a strategic housing plan that's just focused on housing. And you may have a housing needs assessment. But those plans are different than a housing production plan. It's actually a state recognized plan, and it's a way to put the community in the driver's seat around issues involving 40B and housing development. So, we'll talk a lot about what that means and what are the nuances of that. And there's all sorts of terms. If you're not familiar with them yet, you're going to be familiar with them by the time we finish, about what does it mean to have an approved plan? What does it mean to have a certified plan? What's in the plan? But the real basic essence of a housing production plan is that it can give you more control. It can give you control to shape the community's future around local policies that drive the type and location of housing in the community. It can give you control so that you can make progress toward your housing goals on terms that you identify. And it can also help you to preserve and enhance the things that are positive attributes about your community, things that make Medford authentic, things that make Medford, Medford. And really what we're asking, which is at the very heart of this plan, is not just what kind of housing do you need and where do you put it and what does it look like and who does it serve? We're really asking, how should you, the community, protect the characteristics that you love about the community, that you love about Medford, and create more housing options? How can you do both of those things? And so one thing to think about is, what are the characteristics that you love about your community? What are the assets that you love about your community that you really don't want to change? And then it's about finding the best balance. So for every plan we do, we try to look at what is the heart of this community? What are those assets that really should be and need to be preserved? What are the things that help to make this community authentically your community? And how do you balance that against the housing needs that you have in the community and in the region? And I would say that it's a good plan, your housing plan, should really both recognize and honor that there's a dynamic balance of forces and assets that make your community authentic. And if we do our job well, and if we guide you well through this process and the engagement, what we'll come up with is a plan that gives you that balance. So if I say anything, or Anna, when she presents in a little while, that is completely confusing and you cannot get past it, anything that you want me to clarify, just type it in the chat here. Either Anna or I or Alicia or Danielle will see it, and they'll feel free to interrupt me, any panelists, if I don't see a question that somebody has. We're also going to have time for Q&A at the end, but if there's something during this presentation that you're like, wait, what did she just say? I don't understand that. Just feel free to chat it to us. So I also want to clarify that even though the title of this kind of housing plan has the word production in it, I want to clarify what that word production really means. And for the purpose of a housing production plan, production doesn't have to mean just new construction. It often does mean new construction, but it can also mean adaptive reuse and redevelopment of existing properties, of existing resources. And historic preservation can often come into play for these types of adaptive reuse strategies that help you with your production goals. And this is just an example. Out in Williamstown, you can convert all sorts of buildings to housing. Someone said carriage houses. Yeah, that's good. Excellent idea. And so the point really is that the HPP puts you in the driver's seat. You get to decide, well, what are the strategies? We understand from the assessment what our needs are. What are the strategies that can help us reach our housing goals? And I like to say that, you know, people say it's better to teach someone to fish than to provide them the fish. I feel like in some way 40B, comprehensive permits, you know, most community people feel like it's very aggressive. It's like a hammer. And what I like to relate, having a good housing production plan that has strategies that will really help you make progress on your goals, it's kind of like teaching you how to fish. There are ways that you can get control over your own planning and development and preservation initiatives. And a housing plan, if it's done well, will lay out really a roadmap for how you can do that. It teaches you how to reach your goals with local initiatives, regulations. Where do you spend your local funds? How are those prioritized? What is staff working on? And what does zoning in particular allow you or not allow you to do? So I'm going to give you a bit of a primer on housing in Massachusetts and a little bit about 40B as well. So if you don't mind typing in the chat, just tell me if you have never even heard the term 40B before, if this is like a brand new concept for you. Or type in, okay, good. So it's new to some people. And type in if you feel like you kind of know a lot about 40B and comprehensive permits. Okay, so it's a little bit mixed, but it's new for a lot of people. That's good to know. So you might go ahead, Alicia.
I just wanted to clarify because there was a little confusion. Because this is set up as a webinar, only the panelists are able to see anything that anyone puts in the chat. So for those of you who were actively wondering, that's not broken. That's the way it's designed.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So Chapter 40B, you may see things in the news about Chapter 40B and about comprehensive permits and different projects that your Zoning Board of Appeals is reviewing or being proposed in the community. And so I want to give you just some basics of what that means. There's lots of nuances to it, but I'm just going to go over some real basics here. And there's lots of good resources if you want to learn more. I would look at chappa.org. That's a great resource. They have a FAQ and lots of information. But basically a state law. I cited it here. It's Chapter 40B, Mass General Law, Chapter 40B, Sections 20 through 23. It's called the Comprehensive Permit Law. It's also known as the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. And it was created in 1969, and it was really a response to the civil rights movement in the nation. And it really has a very lofty goal. I know a lot of people hate 40B, but it has a very lofty goal of social equity. And what it says is that every community in this state should provide its fair share of affordable housing. And what the statute defines as fair share is 10% of your housing stock, or it also has another way to meet the standard of 1.5% of your general land area shall be dedicated to affordable housing. And most communities really focus in on that 10% of your affordable housing stock. I'm sorry, of your 10% of your year-round housing stock shall be affordable or otherwise counted on the subsidized housing inventory. I'm going to explain all of those terms. I'm going to explain what do I mean by affordable, what do I mean by subsidized housing inventory, and what are the numbers for Medford right now. And so 40B's higher purpose, I think, really is admirable. And it's also it's actually the most effective tool that the state has right now that is producing both affordable and multifamily and mixed income housing all over the state. It's the most effective tool that the state has. So the thing that I think, one of the things I think that is admirable about 40B is that it recognizes that all of the communities have a part to play. Yeah, and someone said 10% is simply not enough based on the area median income in Medford. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. But you're right, 10% is not enough, and I'm going to show you why. But it's really about promoting social equity, and it's about addressing the shortage of affordable housing in the state. And this has been something that we've had an issue with for many, 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 many decades. It's not new, but really it gets back to this concept that, you know, we hear a lot now when people talk about wear your mask and, you know, all these other things, we're in this together. That's really what it's based on. It's looking at the whole state and saying all of these communities should really be contributing. The burden of providing all the housing and affordable housing that the state needs shouldn't fall on a few places. So what happens if the community doesn't meet those goals? It's below the 10% or the 1.5% of the land area. So what happens is developers can seek something called a comprehensive permit. And you probably maybe heard about that in the news. If you haven't, you can Google it and I'm sure it'll come right up. They'll seek a comprehensive permit, and what it does is it allows the developer to ask for waivers from your local zoning board of appeals to override local regulations so that the affordable and mixed income housing can actually be produced. It also streamlines the permitting process. So rather than going to the Conservation Commission and your community development board and all these other boards to get your permit, you just go to the zoning board of appeals. And if a community, if a municipality, the zoning board denies or puts conditions on a comprehensive permit that are unreasonable, making the project uneconomic, a developer can appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee and it is often overturned. So that's why, you know, people say, I feel like we're losing control when it's a comprehensive permit. And in a way you are. It's not as black and white as that, but this is sort of why people feel that way. Is this making sense? Just give me like a yes or a thumbs up or a makes sense or a I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you say that again in the chat there? Okay, great. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks, Jean. So let me describe this term, subsidized housing inventory. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as the SHI units, but it really means subsidized housing inventory. And all it is a list. It's a list that counts all the units that count toward that 10% goal. So I said 10% of every community's year-round housing stock is the goal that 40B sets out. And the way you can tell if you count, you know, how many of those units in your community count is you look at this list called the SHI, the Subsidized Housing Inventory. Units are eligible if they have to meet all four of these things, this criteria. One is that it needs to be subsidized by a state or federal program or done through something called a local initiative. Like, for example, you have something called inclusionary zoning in your community. Not all communities have that, but for communities that do, through your regular zoning, it's not a comprehensive permit, a developer can build affordable or mixed income housing, and those units will also count on the subsidized housing inventory, even though they don't have to be actually subsidized. That term people think means giving public funds. So you can either be subsidized by state or federal programs or done through a local initiative like your zoning. It also has to be affordable to households with low or moderate income. And I'm going to describe what is a household with low or moderate income. And affordable really generally means a household shouldn't spend more than 30% of its gross income on housing costs. And that's what generally is acceptable definition for affordable. It also has to be affirmatively and fairly marketed. So let's say you wanted to create, somebody said carriage house would be great to create affordable housing. Let's say you had a carriage house, you want to create affordable housing on your property. Well, I guess you could do that in some ways, maybe through existing zoning, and you could deed restrict it so that it's number 4 is subject to a long-term affordability restriction. You could probably do that. But the other thing you need to do is affirmatively and fairly market it. So you couldn't just rent that unit, for example, to your mother-in-law or a caregiver or a friend of yours. You would really need to advertise it very broadly all throughout the region to make sure that you're affirmatively and fairly marketing the availability of the unit. And then the way the occupants are actually chosen needs to be done in a fair way as well. It's usually done through a lottery. I'm happy to answer.
Question in the chat. Does this cover renting and owning?
Yes. Yep. Good. Thank you for pointing that out. I missed that. Yeah, it would be both ownership units like condos or even single family houses can count, or rental apartments, whether they're apartments or single family homes, or it would include all of those types of things. The one important thing to know though, and I actually didn't cover this in a slide, so I'm glad somebody asked this, is that if it is a rental development, let's say it's 100% apartments, multifamily apartments, even though about either 20 or 25% of those units would be technically affordable under most of the subsidizing programs that create these comprehensive permit projects, even though only a certain percentage of them are actually affordable and deed restricted, all of the units in a rental project, even the market rate units, even if they're luxury units, they all count toward the community's subsidized housing inventory. So that's why a lot of communities who are really struggling to get to that 10% want to see more rental projects so that they can count all of the units, the affordable deed restricted units, as well as the market rate units. But for ownership units, condos, for example, only the deed restricted affordable units would count on the subsidized housing inventory. Is this making sense? I just went over a ton of technical stuff. So just chat something in the chat if you think that I didn't explain it very well. Okay, so somebody said no, it's not. Okay, a few people are saying it makes sense. How can this help? How can this help the regular person? Yeah. Something I've never understood but get now. Yeah, so affordable housing can help the regular person if by regular person you mean they also have low or moderate income and could potentially qualify for this type of affordable unit. And I'm gonna go over those income limits in a moment so you'll get a sense of, well, you know, what kind of income would qualify as low or moderate income households. Okay, a lot of people are saying yes, it makes sense, great. So far, Medford has 7.2% of its year-round housing units that count on the subsidized housing inventory. So it would need 671 more to reach the full 10%. But I want you to know, and some of you may know already, there are a number of proposals active right now, including 40B comprehensive permit proposals, an inclusionary zoning proposal, the type of zoning that I mentioned before that creates affordable housing, and also some units that are already under construction. And if all those proposals were actually approved, and I'm not saying they will be, I don't know, but if they were, just for the sake of doing the math, Medford would create another 1,116 units, and the subsidized housing inventory goal of 10% would be reached and exceeded, and you'd have 11.9%. Under the captions, it might be hard to see, but what it says is, however, only 333 of those new units would be affordable deed-restricted units available to lower moderate income households. Yeah, Jean says safe harbor, that's right. So after you get to 10%, some people may know the term safe harbor. That means you can deny, and we're going to explain this more when we talk about the plan and getting certified, getting the plan certified, but what safe harbor means is that your ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals, can actually deny a 40B if it's not consistent with local needs, or put additional conditions on that they wouldn't otherwise be able to put on a 40B comprehensive permit application. So it gives you more control to be in safe harbor. Okay, I'm going to keep going here, but please use the chat freely. Will the housing production plan intentionally de-restrict extremely low to low income families? Chapter 40B has historically benefited moderate. Yeah, that's a very good question. Who is affordable housing going to target? So it depends on the subsidy program that the developer is going through, but the kind of the baseline is that the units that are affordable only need to be available to what you're saying is moderate income, the 80% of the area median income or below. They don't often include units that are extremely low or very low unless they're using other subsidy sources. For example, something called a low-income housing tax credits. More of the units need to be lower income. That's also something that as part of the housing production plan, you could say as a goal that you want to really create units that are not right at that 80% of the area median income, but even more deeply affordable for very low or extremely low. What are the present AMIs in the present affordable housing units in Medford? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe in the Q&A, if Alicia or Danielle knows the answer to that. It's a good question. Thank you for asking it. So maybe, Anna, if you could kind of tag that so we can see if we can answer it later. So these are the income limits. These are the current ones. They change every year. And they're put out by the federal government, essentially. And I have two colors here. The 50% is in the navy blue. That's the 50% of the area median income, which some people would call very low income. And then there's the 80% of the area median income, and that would be more of a moderate income. Now, these things go by all sorts of different terms depending on what program you're looking at. So for example, Medford has the Community Preservation Act, and that goes by different terms. And then other subsidy programs call 50%, 80%, different things. So don't get too hung up on the terms low income and moderate income and middle income, and you might hear extremely low income and workforce housing. Those all do have specific definitions, but sometimes they change depending on the subsidy program. So here, I'm just going to use the percentage because that's standard. So 50% of the area median income, if you were a single person living alone in an apartment, let's say, or single family house, doesn't matter, and you earn an income of $44,800 or less, you would be considered at or below 50% of the area median income, and you could qualify for affordable housing. Now that I say could, because you also need to look at your asset levels, asset caps. So if you own a $1 million house and you happen to make a low or very low income, then you wouldn't qualify for affordable housing. But we're just looking at incomes here. So in I guess it's like an orangey brown color, is the 80% of the area median income. So if you were a single person living alone and you made $67,400 or less, you could also qualify for affordable housing. And I just put both of these here because it comes up when we look at something that will tell us an estimate of how many people in your community are spending too much for housing. I want you to know what these income thresholds are so that when I say a certain amount of people making 50% of the AMI or below are cost burden, spending too much on housing, you'll kind of know what are those income categories. Now, the income thresholds change depending on how many households are in a unit. So if you go up, you see this is if 2 people live in the unit. It could be a couple, it could be a parent and a child. It's just 2 people living in a unit. This is the income category. These are the income thresholds. 3 people living in a unit, and then this is 4 people living in a unit, and it goes up from there. I just put 1 person through 4 people just to give you an example. So if you are in a housing unit and you live with 3 other people, so you have 4 people total in your home, then if you make $96,250 or less, you would be considered moderate income, 80% of the AMI or less. If you make $63,950 a year, then you would be considered at 50% of the AMI. Is this making sense? Our needs should be based on our current AMI. These are well above the, yeah, we're going to talk about your median income, median household income in another slide. Okay, great. So if you look at, well, how many households in Medford are estimated to be at these, at the 80% AMI, it's about 42% of all the households estimated. This is based on an estimation. So I just want to tell you, it's not a full count. It's based on the American Community Survey, and that's an estimate. But the estimate is that about 42% of all the households in Medford have low or moderate income, with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income, and could potentially be eligible for affordable housing. Although, as I said before, it really depends on their assets. And that's about 9,265 households. That's what the estimate is. And about 66% of those households are what people call cost burden. It means that according to housing planners and other professionals, if you spend 30% of your income, or if you spend more than 30% of your gross income on housing costs, you're considered cost burden. It's considered that you're spending too much on housing. Some people are actually spending over half of their income on housing, and that's called severely cost burden. But the number I gave you here is that about 66%, or over 6,000 households in Medford, are spending too much for housing, and those are households that are at or below 80% of the area median income. And so you'll remember a few slides ago I talked about what Medford's subsidized housing inventory level is currently, and you can see someone even posted in here earlier, well, we need more than 10% affordable housing. And this is an indicator that she was right when she posted that. So even after Medford achieves that 10% affordable, units that are listed on the SHI, there's still a great local need for homes that are affordable. Okay, I'm just looking at some of the chat. Yeah, many communities, including an increasing number of suburban communities, voluntarily go above the 10%. Yeah, because they know that they need it and there's a local need. Okay, let's try another poll question. We're going to get into a little bit more of this presentation. Oops. Okay, so the next question I'm going to ask you, I'm launching it right now, is do you rent or own? Oh, I'm sorry, that was a typo on my fault. It says rent or won. I assume you didn't win the place you live. Do you rent or own the place where you currently live, or other? And you can just post in the chat when you say other, what you're, yeah, I live with a family who owns, yep. Great. Okay, looks like most of you have voted now. So I will share those results, and you can see that it says that about 46% of the people on this webinar own, and about 31% own, and 23% are other. Great. Okay, I have another question here. Let me launch this one. Okay, here's the next one. What type of property do you currently live in? Single family, 2-family, triple-decker apartment building of 4 or more units, apartment above shops, restaurants, or commercial, townhouse, or other. And you can specify in the chat if I didn't capture your housing situation here. great. I have a few less people voting here, but looks like 73% of you have voted. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Some of you, I think, work in the community, don't live here, so that's fair if you don't do that poll. Okay, so 55% in a single family, 45% in a duplex. Yeah, that's interesting. And that actually reflects the type of housing units that are, many of the housing units that are in Medford. Okay, good. So, okay, so the next one is the types of, I'm not sure if I turned that poll off. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I did. Okay, good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings, some of the preliminary findings, just looking at the needs, the portion of the needs analysis. When we look at what kind of housing does Medford need, we look at a lot of census data and sales price data and rental data and all sorts of different things that we collect. And we try to figure out what is this information telling us. And there's a long draft report that city staff and the working group are making their way through right now that will be released to the public, pretty soon. But then we also like to ask the community what they think their needs are and what their perspective is. So we like to not just base it on just the data. And we're in the process, Anna will talk a little bit more about this, of doing an online survey to try to get a better sense of housing needs. And then we have a few other engagement points that, or opportunities rather, that Anna will talk about in a few minutes. But I just want you to know that what I'm about to share with you is just very preliminary results, and I'm going to share some of the findings based on some of the data analysis. And so the types of homes that we're seeing as most needed are affordable, smaller units, and service enriched and accessible. And so I'm going to go over three main reasons why providing more of these housing types or housing options is important for the community. So one is home prices are too high for people because of a systematically constrained housing supply. And this is not just the case in Medford, just so you know. Home prices are too high for most of Medford's current residents. Somebody asked, what is the Medford's Medford median income, essentially is what they asked. And so this shows you that in the estimated median income for a household living in Medford is about $92,363. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but I'm looking at this bar right here. And 80% AMI for a household of 4, you may remember from one of the previous slides, is about 96,000. So the median, which is 100% of the median, is a little bit less than 80% of the AMI in the whole region. So again, this middle bar here, just tell me that you can see this cursor when I'm moving it around. I don't want to bother pointing to things if you can't see it. Yeah, okay, good. So these middle bars represent the City of Medford's estimated median household income. And this is that 80% for a household of 4. And you can see also, we did some calculations, and you can see down here, we're going to post this PowerPoint if you want to look at these notes more carefully later, but you'll see all the assumptions that went into this calculation here on the bottom in the sources note. But if you look at what the median sales price this is 2019, the most recent year we have to date, it was $630,000. And if you kind of did a backwards calculation on, well, what kind of income would you need to have to be able to afford that sales price if you don't spend more than 30% of your income on housing costs? And so what that calculation, there's lots of assumptions that go into this, but the calculation is roughly about 150,000. We got 149,500. So you can see that's a significant difference. And so between what median income household living in Medford could afford, $350,000 purchase price, versus what the median sales price is in Medford, it's about a $280,000 gap. So it's significant. So what does this mean? It means that home prices are too high for most of Medford's current residents. So if you, and I'm just saying you, I don't know if you fit this category or not, but if you wanted to move into Medford now, my guess is some of you, maybe a lot of you, couldn't afford to now. Okay. Okay, I'm looking at some of the questions. Lots of subdivision and flipping that exponentially elevates our housing values. Okay. A small percentage with very high incomes throw off the reality. Okay, fair enough. I mean, this is looking at the median, but you know, certainly you do have a lot of lower income households as well. And I'll talk about that, I think, coming up pretty soon. Let's see. Before I talk about that though, let me just mention that we looked at your assessor's data and the valuations. And so these are always, you know, lower than if you actually put something on the market. The assessed values are usually lower than what you could actually get on the market. But just looking at the assessed values, about 361 single family homes in Medford were valued at or below that $350,000, which is what we calculated a median income household in Medford could roughly afford. And that represents just 4.6% of all the single family units in Medford. This one doesn't look at condos, just so you know. And most of these more affordable, you know, not affordable with a capital A, they're not deed restricted units. They're, you know, less expensive units, let's say. Most of them are clustered here. You can see the arrows pointing in the North Medford and Fulton Heights neighborhoods. Does that, can someone just type in, is anybody surprised by that, or does that make sense given what you know on the ground of the neighborhoods? Yes, okay, it makes sense. Not surprised. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, and now let's look at rents. So rents are also too high. If you look at the current renter households in Medford and what their median income is, and you do a calculation so that if the median income household, median renter, so I just want to be clear, we're looking at not that median income that I gave you before, but if you're a renter in Medford, if you already rent now, your median house, the median household of all the renter house, the median income, sorry, of all the renter households is $70,572. And so we just did a calculation. If you weren't going to spend more than 30% of your income towards your housing costs, what could you afford? And so we calculated you could afford about $1,700, a little over $1,764. And the median rent, this is based on MLS data. So we, Anna, we should thank the realtor too publicly. I can't remember her name, but there was a realtor who helped us get this MLS data. And so the median rent 2019 was $2,300. And so you can see that there's also a gap between what the median renter can afford and what the median rents are.
Jennifer, actually, the realtor is Jennifer Keenan, and she's on the call this evening.
Jennifer, thank you. That's right. Jennifer Keenan, thank you so much for being on this call. We did really appreciate all the help that you gave us. You can also see that rents have been rising, and we just gave you a graphic that goes back to 2014. Okay, so when you think about why prices are so high, part of the reason is that there's been a constrained housing supply because of land use regulations is one of the primary reasons that there's been a constrained housing supply. It's not just in Medford. It's, you know, this actual report, if you haven't seen it yet, I really recommend that you look at it if you're really interested in how this all works and how it happens and what some, you know, very smart people have been concluding. There was a study called The State of Zoning for Multifamily Housing in Greater Boston. And so there were 4 general conclusions, and the report's very detailed. So I'm not really totally doing it justice by boiling it down to these 4 things, but basically it said there's very little land overall in the region that's actually zoned for multifamily, meaning sometimes things are zoned for multifamily, but it's actually not feasible because there aren't any sites around to actually build what the zoning requires. But there's a lot of land zoned for single family and even for, you know, for some 2-family and townhouses, but there's very little land zoned for multifamily. Also, there's a lot of project by project discretionary decision making. And what that means is there isn't a lot of things that a developer, if they wanted to build multifamily housing, could actually do by right. And that's why a lot of developers go toward the 40B and the comprehensive permit route, because going project by project with this highly discretionary zoning is very uncertain, takes a long time. And a lot of communities zoning regulations are just not clear. It's so discretionary that you don't actually know what you could propose that would get approved. Allowing multifamily, but only as mixed use with like commercial on the ground floor is usually what mixed use is defined as, even if the market isn't always there for that commercial. And so that's also a barrier when you don't allow multifamily without that commercial component. And then limiting multifamily options allowed in your downtowns and centers, really favoring the periphery of communities. And so what that does is it creates, more isolated developments that are not well connected to, often they're not well connected to public transit or even the social fabric of the community. And so those were some of the 4 key findings of this report, and it was done by Amy Dane. And so I encourage you to look that up. And so let's just look at Medford in terms of your housing growth in this community. The overall net housing growth has been low. Sometimes people may feel, oh, it feels like it's high because we've gotten all these proposals lately and it feels like there's been a lot of new development. Well, even despite that, when you account for, looking at the housing growth, the overall net housing growth, and this is based on, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is based on census data. The American Community Survey, so it's an estimate. You've seen about 1% of net new housing since 2010 and about 6% since 2000. And those growth rates are both much lower than the county and the state has seen. And I have those figures down in the footnote if you're interested. The county grew 4% and the state grew 3% in the 2010 to 2018 timeframe. And then both geographies experienced about 10% housing growth since 2000. And so why do we look at this and why has it been a lower net housing growth? So we did look at your zoning, and we'd like to talk more about your zoning as the process unfolds. But we did a mapping analysis to just see roughly what properties could be developed that actually comply with your zoning requirements for multifamily. And we found very few properties that are currently undeveloped that meet your multifamily development requirements. And both the density, meaning the lot size requirements, and the units per acre that are allowed, as well as the height requirements, seem to be the biggest barriers in your zoning regulations. And so when zoning creates a development barrier, what often happens, if the market is there and the demand is there, a developer's more likely to pursue development through 40B comprehensive permit because the zoning is so restrictive that they can't get something that's feasible. They can't find a site that's feasible and meets the zoning requirements, or they just can't get enough units to make the numbers work to make the project feasible. I'm happy to take some Q&A on that. I know I just went over a lot, but let's just keep going here. So the second point I wanted to make about this kind of a whole category of findings, but the second overall finding is that people's incomes haven't grown much if you look at how much housing prices have risen. And so the system's really broken. You're not seeing that as incomes rise, housing costs are rising and things are kind of keeping pace. You're not seeing that in this state, or really in the region, I would say. These are just general state numbers, but the income and just very broadly from 2000 to 2018, income rose about 19%. This is median household income, and median gross rent rose about almost 80%, 79%, and median sales price rose about 102%. So you can just see that incomes aren't keeping pace with the level of housing cost increases. And so what this tells an economist is that there's a supply and demand, that the system's off balance, and there's so many people in our communities that need safe, decent, affordable housing, but there's not enough. And when I say affordable housing, I mean housing that people can afford, whether it's deed restricted and counts on the subsidized housing inventory. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's just not enough housing and the prices are so high, and that's partially because the system is off balance. So what does this do? This can do a lot of things. It can push out people who've lived in your community for a long time as their rents raise, maybe. It can also push out your workforce, including essential workers. It can hurt economic competitiveness, not just of the community, but of the region and of the state as a whole. And there's been lots and lots of studies around this. And you've probably heard Governor Baker speaking about it. And there's a whole workforce housing initiative. There's lots of, housing choice initiative and all sorts of things at the state level and lots of studies. And I just showed you one study here, the growing shortage of affordable housing for extremely low in Massachusetts. And you can Google that and read it if you're interested in learning more. When you don't have and I'm saying financially sustainable home now to distinguish it from an affordable home that's deed restricted. So when your home is too expensive compared to the income that you make, then what happens? So it spreads your income very thin because you're paying a lot for housing costs, and you may not have a lot of disposable income left over. You may not even have a lot to fund transportation or healthcare or food, and it also erodes your disposable income, how much income you can put back into the local or regional economy through your spending. And it also increases the chance that you could lose your home. And so there's a lot of housing instability. You can see a lot in the news now, especially with the pandemic, and all of the economic insecurity has also led to housing insecurity. And it's been very both illuminated in the news. You can Google and find lots of articles on it, but it's also been exacerbated. But this is an issue that has been there for a long time. It's worse because of the pandemic, but it really has been there underlying for a long time. And so this chart, if you can see it, is I was talking to you about before. I was going to show you how many households are very low income with 50% of the area mean income or below in your community in Medford. So that's about 4,655 households. And how much of those are spending, sorry, I'm misspeaking. 4,655 are actually the very low income households who are spending too much for housing. So they're spending over the 30% AMI, and they're represented in this bar here. It's the combination of the 47% and the 26%. The darker blue is for households that are moderately cost burdened, spending between 30 and 50% of their income on housing costs. And the lighter blue is severely cost burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on housing costs. You can see this bar is for households in Medford. This is all estimates, by the way. Households estimated in Medford that have 50% to 80% of the AMI, that's their income level. And you can see that about half, just under half of all of those households are cost burdened. And then other households that are in more than 80% of the AMI, some of them are also cost burdened, but certainly not as many proportionally to as you get lower. And it makes sense logically. But you can see here that about 3,000 of the lowest income, the 50% AMI or lower, shown on this bar chart in the light blue, this represents about 3,000 households that are severely cost burdened, meaning for every dollar they earn, they're putting 50% of it into their housing costs. So they're spending half or more of their income on housing. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but is this making sense? If someone said my graduate level children cannot afford to purchase a home anywhere in the area. Yeah. Jennifer says there's only 21 single family homes for sale in Medford right now. Okay, so the third point I wanted to make is that there's also a mismatch between the size and type of Medford's housing units, the existing housing units, and the size and needs of Medford's households. So I wanted to draw you back. A lot of the time I'm drawing you back to look at statewide or regional figures, but this time I'm going back and having you look at the whole country. And so the whole country is experiencing a rise in single person households and a fall in nuclear family households with multiple, this shows a little picture of 2 parents and 2 kids. And this is a publication by AARP called Making Room, Housing for a Changing America 2019. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to Google that one too. And really the point of this publication is that popular vision of the American dream and what an American household is, it's changed. It's not even changing, it has changed. It's inaccurate, it's outdated. And so I wanted to give you that picture before I gave you the more detailed picture of Medford. And so in Medford, and these are estimates, but in Medford, the dark blue represents the number of family households. So about 63% of your households are family households, and about 30% 37% rather of your households are non-family households. And so the non-family households are both people living alone and people living with roommates. And Anna, I think these numbers are wrong. Are you looking at that right now? Anyway, let's go with the percentages. I'm confident that the percentages are right, even if the numbers here are wrong for some reason. But if the light blue is non-family households, who does that include? That includes people living alone. And it also includes people living with roommates who are not your family, or you're not married to them. And so if you look at all the people living alone in Medford, so about 78% of the non-family households are people living alone. And out of that, out of all the people living alone, about 41% of them are seniors living alone. Seniors meaning 65 years old or older. And then the other thing that we saw from our analysis is that older residents tend to live in Medford's central or northern neighborhoods. So I talked a few slides ago about the type and size of housing units are mismatched from the population. So you'll see there's a lot of people living alone. There's a lot of non-family households, and including seniors living alone. And so one of our conclusions is that many people in Medford appear to be overhoused. And you can see these two charts on the bottom. So this is looking at an estimate, it's an estimate. It's looking at the household size. This is based on the American Community Survey estimates. And so about 30% of the households in the community are one person. About 36% of the households are two people living together. 18% is three people, 11% four people, and then 6% five and over. But if you look at the housing size, about 68% of the housing stock is 2 or 3 bedroom, and 16% is 4 bedroom or more. And only about 16% studios or 1 bedroom. And so one thing that tells us is that a lot of people are probably living in homes that are relatively large in size compared to the size and configuration of their household. And so here's an example, and you may or may not resonate. This may or may not resonate with you, but what we find is that, empty nester couples, if they can't find another housing option, perhaps in the community that they want to stay in, they stay in the larger home that they raise their kids in because they want to stay in the community. And so empty nester couples still living in the 4-bedroom home that they raise their kids in is one example of what we mean by someone who's probably overhoused. Is this resonating with people? Just say yes or no. I have no idea what you're talking about, Jen. Okay, people are saying yes for the most part. Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Okay, and so this is looking at the age of who's living in your community. So compared to other communities with similar characteristics as Medford, Medford has one of the higher proportion of young adult residents. So you see that 31% of Medford's residents are, actually I can't see the ages here. I think it's, 20 to 34 years old. It's under the captions. 18% are children under 19 years old. And then 37% are 35 to 64-year-olds, and 65% are 14%, sorry, are 65 and over. And so this middle bar is for the county, and this bar on the left is for the state. And so the one on the right is Medford. Millennials tend to live in Medford's southern and northwestern areas, particularly concentrated, as I'm sure you're not surprised, and that's my dog, around Tufts University. But we also want to recognize that about 2,400 residents, which is about 4% of your total population, live in group quarters, and that includes about 1,435 that are living in student housing. The other thing, we looked at some growth projections of population growth, and what the projections show us is that Medford will continue to grow over the next decade, but that the average household size, so the number of people who are living together in a household, will fall, which will further increase the demand for those smaller housing units that we were talking about. So Medford's average household size was 2.4 0.41 people per unit, and that's slightly lower than we see in the county as a whole and the state as a whole. And then I talked a little bit about in the top of this section about the need for service-enriched housing too. And so what I have here is both service-enriched and special needs housing, including accessible homes, are also needed in the community. And so one, let's talk about homelessness. The estimated number of households experiencing homelessness in the region has more than doubled between 2010 and 2019. And so the number one solution for addressing homelessness in the region is really providing more affordable, including service-enriched homes. And what do I mean by that? Support services that people in transitional housing, people struggling with a variety of special needs benefit from living in service-enriched housing that provides services sort of that are home-based services that can be, I'm not explaining this very well, but it's different than having a housing unit that's affordable that you need to basically get any services you need by going somewhere else. So the services, sometimes there's somebody, a caregiver, for example, living in the housing complex with a variety of people. You can see congregate living or group homes that are set up like that, and other types of housing models that are service-enriched housing. The other reason I talk about service-enriched and special needs and accessible housing is that it can help connect people with disabilities, whether or not they were at risk or experiencing homelessness. People with disabilities have access to better healthcare and support, and it can also help seniors stay in the community as they age and maybe provide some housing options outside of what I said was, you know, an overhoused situation in the house maybe they raise their kids in. So is this making sense? I think that's my last slide, and then Anna's going to shift into the HPP basics and talking more about the housing production plan. Can folks just say that you're kind of following along and you're makes sense, or Jen, you're crazy, I don't know what you're talking about? Okay, thank you. That's great. Good. Okay, Anna, I'm going to mute myself.
Great. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through some of the kind of a crash course in a housing production plan, and I'll talk a little bit also around some of the things that we included in looking at the development constraints analysis, and then I'll talk a little bit about, now that you've sat through this entire presentation and you have maybe more questions or ideas on how you can stay involved in the process going forward. Okay, next slide. Jen? I think, oh yeah, okay, good, great. So a housing production plan has to include a couple things. A comprehensive needs assessment, which a lot of that information that we included, Jen's been pulling into this presentation and highlighting some of the things in it. And it analyzes basically whether or not the community's current housing stock is meeting the needs of both its current population and also the projected needs of the population as it changes, and where there might be gaps between current housing stock and projected needs. It also includes this development constraints analysis, which basically looks at environmental, regulatory, and infrastructure concerns. And I'll talk through some of the findings and things that we looked at more in detail over the next couple of slides. And then the third piece that we include, it includes goals and strategies on how to achieve that 10% threshold. So although the primary purpose of a housing production plan is basically to serve as a roadmap or guide to reach that 10%, it also can include these strategies and goals to meet other housing needs. As Alicia was touching on at the beginning, this is an affordable housing production plan. And so it can include things on how to address middle income units, which aren't included necessarily on the subsidized housing inventory. It can include programs such as that provide direct assistance to households, like first-time home buyers assistance program, or emergency rental assistance program, which I know Medford recently created with CPA funds. And it can also just generally address how to create more diverse housing options, like accessory dwelling units or accessory apartments, or cluster housing, so others kind of different housing types. Okay, next slide. Oh, Jen, can you go back one slide? Great. So in looking at the development constraints and opportunities, the development constraints analysis really asks the question, what would impact or limit affordable housing development? And so we look at these environmental considerations such as critical habitats, soil types, wetlands, flooding, and not only where it currently floods, but also looking at projected sea level rise and associated flooding, particularly as Medford is impacted as a coastal community with the Mystic River. So sea levels, and it has a little information on the slide, but sea levels in the Boston region are expected to rise by at least 9 inches by 2030, 21 inches by 2050, and 36 inches by 2070. Another thing that includes, we look at these former industrial sites where there might be possible contamination still in the soil. Even if the site has been cleaned up, we also want to look at where there might be potential health implications for those former industrial sites. And on the map, they're shown here as activity and use limitation sites with these little circle with the slash through them. And then we also want to look at what are the aspects of Medford that you want to protect, the city's green spaces, its water quality, its historic assets, such as, its local historic districts that might have additional impacts and constraints around any renovation or redevelopment in those districts would be under closer scrutiny and require kind of closer monitoring for those. And as part of the housing production plan, we also we think about how can we integrate some of these values and elements of the community that is valued, and how can we integrate those into new housing that's being developed. And lastly, it looks at these regulatory considerations, including the basic question of where can you build specific types of housing under the city's current zoning ordinance. And it also looks at what might make it difficult to build affordable housing and different housing types, and what tools does the city currently have that would help facilitate affordable housing to be built in Medford, such as inclusionary zoning. I'm not looking at the chat, but does that sort of make sense to everybody? Anything that I'm missing? Okay, next slide. So one of the things that we found when looking through this was you'll notice that a lot of the areas that are most vulnerable to flooding and also contain most of these activity and use limitation sites are mostly located in Medford's southern neighborhoods that I've circled here in this circle. These areas also tend to be these lower income neighborhoods and contain these environmental justice populations. And environmental justice neighborhoods are those neighborhoods that are lower income, at least 1 in 4 residents identify as minority, or at least 1 in 4 households are non-English speakers. And this is sort of underscored for us that these environmental impacts and benefits are not equally distributed among residents, likely due to land use policies and development patterns that were developed within these systems of privilege. And these areas are also where a lot of Medford's larger multifamily and rental options are concentrated. Okay, next slide. So the other piece, I sort of mentioned some of these constraints around development, but we also want to look at what are some development opportunities. And one of those, so the central question that we ask is, where are these opportunities for building affordable housing? Where can we and should encourage development, and at what scale? And so one of those things, Medford has really great transit access. And one of those is near current and future transportation hubs could be potential sites to encourage housing development. So the Green Line extension coming in December 2021, that'll provide service to Boston Avenue and College Avenue in Medford are some areas that we should be or perhaps considering as areas for housing development. Okay, next slide. And then as part of this, we also looked at the current transportation hubs. And so TODEX, this is showing some maps from TODEX, which is a tool developed by the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and that analyzes basically the densities surrounding these transit hubs throughout Massachusetts. And they sort of say that a rule of thumb is an average of 10 to 12 homes per acre within a half mile of a transit hub is considered, good, healthy enough to help sustain a healthy transit system. And so Medford's 2 kind of transit station hubs right now. The Wellington T-stop for the Orange Line has 7.5 units per acre. And the West Medford commuter rail station has 6.6 units per acre. So they're both lower than this sort of rule of thumb that we have 10 to 12 homes per acre. And we know that these walkable and transit-rich neighborhoods are also being increasingly kind of desirable for all ages and incomes. So this is one of these areas that we kind of highlighted as maybe potentially areas for future development. Okay, next slide. So this map is showing sites where land is more valuable than the buildings and improvements. And those areas are shown in the yellow and red on this map. And so these areas where the land is more valuable than the buildings or the improvements can often be strong candidates for redevelopment or adaptive reuse. Jenn sort of at the beginning of the presentation talked about how adaptive reuse can be even though this is called a housing production plan, production doesn't necessarily mean construction. It can mean redevelopment or rehabilitation of current buildings, which can also help preserve kind of the existing character of some of these neighborhoods. Okay, so many of these sites are located in the city's commercial 2 and industrial and office districts. Yeah, Jenn, either slide is fine. And all of these areas don't currently allow any sort of residential development. And so one of the questions we sort of posited was, could a freshening of these zoning requirements for these areas help shape redevelopment or preservation through adaptive reuse? So that was one of the questions we kind of came up as we were going through this. Okay, next slide. So the housing production plan, in the strategies that we put together, it must identify some of these zoning amendments. And so one of the questions that, the question that I just posited around zoning, that's a question that, in addition to any other zoning amendments, is one of the things that can be included in a housing production plan as a strategy. It also should identify specific private or municipally owned properties that could be potential housing development sites. And that could either be supported through rezoning or through other efforts to really support and encourage development on those specific sites. It also can identify characteristics of preferred development. And so that could also include things like encouraging green housing or encouraging specific height regulations or specific density regulations as part of that, to make sure that it fits within the character of the neighborhoods that you have. And then also sort of identify participation in regional collaborations. So, housing is a regional issue, and it's not, I know that someone in the chat already mentioned this, that, housing is something that's being affected throughout Massachusetts and the Boston region. And so it's only going to be a problem that's going to be solved through these regional partnerships. And so that's something that we look at in terms of, is one of the strategies with the housing production plan. Okay, next slide. So Jenn mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but the #1 benefit of a housing production plan is that it lets you shape your own future. It puts you in the driver's seat. And so one of the questions we sort of think about is, what strategies can support greater housing options? What's realistic and implementable? And how would you do it? And so I'll get into this in a few slides when I sort of talk about the next steps for the planning process. But that's the sort of goal. The next steps is thinking about, how do you actually go about achieving and meeting the needs of that we've identified through this needs assessment, and thinking about strategies that can help find some solutions to these. Okay, next slide. The second benefit of the housing production plan is that it gives you some control. So there's two different, Jenn sort of talked about this at the beginning too. There's kind of 2 differences between an adopted housing production plan and a certified housing production plan. So the community, after we create this, we're in the process of creating the plan, but the next step after that is that the Community Development Board, the City Council, and the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD, approve that plan. And so once you have that plan, you still need to put it into action and show a commitment to producing units. Just to have the plan isn't enough. You need to actually implement the plan. And so as part of that, you need to show you need to permit at least 0.5% of the current total units, housing units. And so for Medford, you would need to permit 120 subsidized housing inventory homes in a calendar year. And that would let you enter safe harbor for up to a year. And if you permit 240 subsidized housing inventory homes, that would let you enter safe harbor for up to 2 years. And so that would let you earn a state certified plan that allows you to enter safe harbor. And as long as those permitted units remain income eligible, Medford will keep that certification. You'll still receive 40B applications, but the state certification lets you deny 40B applications that come in. Okay, any questions? I know that this is often a place that people get kind of tripped up. Or is that making sense to everybody? If you want to just throw it into the chat. Okay, let's go on to the next slide then. Oh, I see one question. What's safe harbor? Yeah, so safe harbor basically means that you have a certified plan and it allows you to deny any comprehensive permits. Jen, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so a certified community, so if you've entered safe harbor, it allows you to deny any comprehensive permits that you get. And the ZBA's decision will then be upheld by the Housing Appeals. Okay, next slide. So the next sort of question is, what can you do now? And so I'll go through kind of the schedule and then where do we go from this webinar, basically. So I have all of these chats covering the screen. So housing plays an important role in well-being and equity, and so we really need you to help us answer this question and sort of help shape the future of housing in Medford. So this process is a chance to not only get involved, but to help shape local policies and have some control over how and where housing is built in Medford. Okay, next slide. So this schedule shows the current, you'll see that we're in June here, and so we're in this public engagement process of the project. And so in March and April, we had our project kickoff, and we've been collecting and reviewing and analyzing data and developing the needs assessment. And then in May, we launched our housing survey. I don't know, Jen, if there's a poll ready for folks who have or have not filled out the survey.
No, I forgot to do that one. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So maybe just throw it in the chat if you have had a chance to fill out the survey. Just let us know. Great. Yeah. So I think we've had almost 300 responses so far, and it's live through June 15th. So if you haven't already, please send it around to everyone that you know, and encourage people that there's still time to fill out the survey. And I'll have the survey link in the next slide, actually. And so after this webinar, we'll be having focus groups in June, and there'll be also a link on the next slide to sign up. And then we'll be having another presentation after all this engagement, kind of report back on some of the things that we heard. In terms of there's a question in the chat, is there a non-online version for non-tech savvy people? Yeah, so there's a version available in Spanish that's online. And then maybe this is a better question to cover in the Q&A, but we're gonna offer a phone number or email to be able to call and help them fill it out over the phone, I believe is the way that we've decided on that. But we can cover that maybe in the Q&A. And so after this engagement, we'll be drafting the housing production plan and finalizing the housing plan with a presentation to the Community Development Board and the City Council. And then we'll be submitting the revised plan to the DHCD. Okay, next slide. So there are 3 ways that we're sort of identifying of how you can contribute from, you know, somewhat easy peasy to if you really want to dive deeper into it. So the first and easy thing, which I think a lot of people just said that they did, was to complete the survey that we have on SurveyMonkey, and it's live through June 15th. The second thing is we have some questions and a mapping exercise and some handouts on the city's website that you can download from the link that's on here. And you can, you know, sort of go through the questions and respond to them on your own time, read the materials, do the mapping exercise, and then just submit your responses to the Community Development Department, either by mail or by email to Danielle. And that's one way to get involved. And then especially if you have some ideas for actions to include in the plan, we want to encourage you to sign up for one of these focus groups that we have. There's a link to the Sign Up Genius, which is being blocked by the closed captioning text. But there's also information. All of these links are available on the website, on the city's website, this community development / housing production plan. So we have these 2 first come, first serve focus groups. And we're also inviting a variety of stakeholders to participate in focus groups as well, to get a sense of really diving into implementation and strategies and goals to include in the plan. So if your interest was kind of piqued by this presentation, and as we were going through it, you had all these ideas for things that you want to see included in the plan, the focus groups might be a really good opportunity and way for you to participate in the plan. Okay, next slide. So when I talked about the materials on the city's website, these are these 3. So on the left, there's basically a summary sheet of most of the information that is included in this presentation, and goes over some of the key trends and challenges from the needs assessment, and includes some of the maps that we saw in this presentation as well. And then it also includes the second in the middle are these focus group questions that is available in a Word doc. So you can either print it out or fill it out on your computer and email it back in. That kind of goes through some of the questions that we'll be talking about in the focus groups. And then last on the right is this mapping exercise. And you know, I mentioned as part of the housing production plan, we ask people to identify specific sites or areas where you think either should be rezoned to help really facilitate and encourage housing development, or could be potentially good sites for either, you know, single family development, duplexes, larger multifamily, or mixed use. And that's kind of the point of that last mapping exercise. And there's both a suggested legend that we include, but also depending on what materials you have on hand, you can create your own legend for different things. And there's also a space to explain more information around sort of your markings up on the map. And I think that's everything. Jen, if you want to go to the next slide. So I think we're ready to open it up to questions.
Yeah, and I think if all the panelists can get on now, Danielle and Alicia too, we do have a couple questions that have been submitted. People can either send questions in through the chat or the Q&A. It doesn't matter. We see them both. And we can kind of take them. I have a couple here. Maybe we've got one question here that says, to what extent and in what ways will the HPP consider non-housing solutions to improving affordability in Medford, if at all, such as improved public transportation, walkability, and social services? And I guess, I mean, chime in as well, the rest of the panel, but you know, the housing production plan really is very focused on housing production, but it can look at other ancillary things like, are there programs, for example, I'll give you an example of a rental assistance program, like a local Section 8 kind of program, emergency rent assistance, or you can make it, you know, even non-emergency as well. A lot of communities who've adopted these types of programs, Martha's Vineyard is one example, basically use it to help subsidize rental housing through a local Section 8. Some people call it informally the local Section 8 or a local voucher. So that's an example of something that you can do because in the housing, and you can talk about in the housing production plan as one strategy, but it doesn't actually create units. It's providing direct assistance to households. But in terms of improving public transit and walkability, I don't see a lot of housing production plans, and I don't think the ones that I've completed talk much, maybe in the goals they talk about how having housing production near public transportation and in walkable neighborhoods, but they don't really have specific ideas that would help improve transportation or pedestrian walkability or bicycling or whatnot. The only other exception I can think, sometimes in plans we have things about the type of housing that doesn't have to do with the level of affordability or the type of housing, mean it multifamily or small units, but they'll have things about the characteristics of how sustainable, or if it's environmentally sustainable construction methods and materials or renewable energy sources are used. Sometimes we'll put things like that if that comes up as something in the community that they want to see. So I hope that answers your question, Erica. And chime in the chat if you feel like you want more clarification. Does anyone else on the panel want to chime in?
So what I can actually add to that, and before I do, I will actually also say, since we started, I have been joined in the room that I'm in by my teen son playing video games. So I apologize if you hear anything you shouldn't hear on a webinar. But in regards to looking at these other issues that we need to look at, one of the things that we've been really interested in doing in Medford under this new administration is being more holistically looking at everything that is going on. And so very specifically to this, and actually it's partially an answer to one of the other questions. Somebody asked about looking at zoning. So let me answer both questions at once. There's actually two efforts that are going on. One with zoning is that the city council is hiring a lawyer to look at zoning and zoning diagnostic and to start to really understand better what needs to be changed in Medford. And that is one effort. Another effort is that the city administration is working. We were going to put out the RFP. We're going to launch a comprehensive planning process in March, and then March happened. But we've been talking about it, and so we're hoping this summer. And a comprehensive planning process would actually, in fact, look at all of those things that you asked about. And it would take, housing would be one section of it. So we wouldn't do a deep dive in housing as part of that plan because we're doing it right here. So we would incorporate all these learnings from the housing, but we would do some deep dives in some of the other areas like transportation and social services and stuff. In addition to that, we've actually been working with community development pretty closely with our health department and Office of Outreach and Prevention. We've been doing actually a climate vulnerability grant that looks at social services and what are the social services in Medford and how can we bring them together and have local places where people can go around social services. And then, in fact, we were discussing today applying for another round to continue working to bring social services together in Medford and look at how we've actually been mapping where are they located. So we're looking at all of those things more holistically in addition to the housing production plan. And so rather than doing them in this plan is going to be one piece that's feeding our larger planning efforts in the city.
Alicia, I have a question that I think you can answer that someone asked a while back. Can you talk about, if you are a Medford resident, how would you go about applying for affordable housing and finding out what's available in the community?
Okay. So Danielle, give me a sign if you think you have a better answer to this. So traditionally, it hasn't been very visible to people, but we have put together, affordable housing doesn't actually come available that often in Medford. When a new big building opens with 30 units, then there is a lot. But other than that, it tends to be a one-off opportunity here and there. So one of the things that we have done is actually set up a mailing list. And if you go to the City of Medford, to the Office of Community Development and Affordable Housing, you can sign up for our email list, be notified when there's a affordable housing lottery available. And I'll tell you that since I took over the office in January, there hasn't been an affordable housing lottery. So these don't come up a lot. Somebody asked if we could put the link in the chat. And I think that I can do that when I stop talking. And also, you can always call our office at 781, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to misspeak it, 393-2480. If I got that wrong, somebody will please tell me. And we can also add you manually to the email list if you prefer to call and ask to be added to that.
Okay, Danielle, did you unmute because you wanted to chime in?
I'm just also going to say that when a lot of new units are proposed to come online, that to get on the subsidized housing inventory, they have to affirmatively market those units. So there would be some kind of outreach campaign, ads in the paper in different languages, hopefully spreading the word is as wide as I can. So it's not just a matter of being on our mailing list. Part of our oversight is making sure that these are being marketed properly to spread the word.
So I'm going to share in the chat actually the link to our page of affordable housing and proposed 40B projects, because there is the second link on the page is the Mass Access Housing Registry, which is a search engine that is maybe very helpful to a lot of people. And then the third link is Affordable Housing Lottery Mailing List. Click here to sign up. So I feel like it would be helpful to have the whole page and not just the direct link to sign up.
Okay, thanks. That's great, Alicia. I have another question. I think maybe Alicia, you might be good to answer this one. Two of them are very similar, so I'll read them both. One is, given our failure to address the needs of our community, why would we be opposed to 20 to 25% affordable housing with a 40B? And the second question or comment is, if we have a housing supply problem, why would we want to deny 40B applications and comprehensive permits? Don't we need more housing? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I actually also had lost my cursor up on my other screen. I apologize. So those are very good questions. And so the idea with the comprehensive permit and the reason we want to deny it is because they don't have to abide by any of our zoning or any of our local regulations when they propose this building. And through that process, they only have to abide by state codes. And therefore, the city has no say in how high it is, how close to the edge, any of this stuff. Green space, stormwater regulations, unless it's a state regulation, they don't have to meet it. So it's not that we don't want those housing units, it's that we want to have a dialogue and a conversation with them. And so we're very interested in having conversation with the developers and coming to an agreement in a place on a project that is acceptable to the whole of the community and not just adding more units. For example, one of the proposed 40B projects is right on a neighborhood, and residents in that neighborhood are very nervous about 400 additional units on some of the one-way streets that are there. And so we need to have some conversation about how does this work, and is 400 the right number, and to look at the details of it and have a say in how the whole development looks. Does it fit in? But you can imagine that they're nervous about the traffic in that neighborhood. So it's less about denying the units and more about wanting the developers to work with the city on what it is that they're building in the city.
Okay, thanks. All right, this one I'm going to answer. It says, given the resistance to new development that exists already, despite the relatively small amount of development, does the HPP also recommend strategies for communicating the need for housing to the community? And the answer is it can. And in many of the plans that we've worked on, we do include both recommendations for education, information, outreach engagement, and also growing capacity, if that's indicated, so that the community can better communicate or can also manage and launch local initiative. But communication and housing campaigns, local housing campaigns, or having a group, I mean, actually you already have a group in the community. What is it called, Alicia? Medford for All, or Medford Housing for All, something like that.
Housing Medford.
Housing Medford, sorry. They're going by different names in different communities. So yeah, recommending strategies for communicating the need for housing is actually relatively common in the plans that, that we've done. Let's see, what else is here? I'm not seeing, yeah, that's everything I'm seeing. Does anybody else have any questions that they hoped we answered that, you know, either we missed or, okay, here's one. If Medford zoning artificially constrains housing supply, why should we want developers to abide by our zoning? Doesn't that just make the problem worse? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you could say they should just use 40B and, you know, do something that, you know, doesn't meet your zoning. But I mean, as a planner, I would prefer to see ideally zoning that matches what your community actually wants to see, and the kind of housing and other development that you really envision in the community. And I think this housing production plan can help you determine some of those improvements to your zoning so you can you know, make those changes. But also the master plan effort that Alicia talked about can also help you envision what, you know, for the various neighborhoods and areas with potential development opportunities, what kind of zoning could be put in place, or what kind of amendments could we have to our existing zoning that could really help help realize that vision that we'd like to see.
We had a great comment in the chat that zoning is a social contract between the city and its residents. So
That's nice. I like that. Yeah.
Right. And Medford zoning, I mean, one of the things is that we need to look at it. It hasn't been changed in more than 30 years. I mean, we haven't done a comprehensive zoning look probably since the 1950s. We, you know, we might make a tiny little amendment here or there. So something we want to do is say, is the zoning that's here right for now? So part of the housing production plan is that Jennifer's team will be pointing out things to us that we might want to consider, that we might want to change, where are the restrictions, what should we be looking at? And then we want to look at it in a big picture kind of way and communicate with the residents. And part of sort of our delay with launching the comprehensive plan, just simply because we didn't know how things were going to unfold, is that it's really important to be talking to the residents and hearing them. And that usually involves going to where they are, which is still really hard. So we're hoping that by delaying a few months, it'll be easier for us to go to where the residents are, talk to them. We really felt that the transition team meetings that the mayor held in December were really well organized and well attended, and there was a lot of interest, and people really heard from people. And to do something modeled after that on a broader scale with the whole community around all of these issues, and to use some of the information that they collected at those as well, but to talk about it in terms of what do people want today in Medford, and not what do people want in 1954 in Medford, which is when our zoning code was written.
So I've got one here. You people are very well read and well informed. I have a question here. There is research out of BU that says people who weigh in on developments are whiter and wealthier on average than the local community and overwhelmingly opposed to development. Can the HPP advocate that all residents are heard, not just those like people on this call? Yeah, it's complicated, of course, in terms of how you go about doing that and what the best mechanism is to ensure, you know, what's the reality of hearing from all residents is probably not likely, but how can you reach, you know, broader understanding of what your community wants and opinions about certain development proposals. And, you know, part of what we're doing is this housing production plan is you know, trying to hear from as many people as possible, but there's also the challenge of the fact that you know, there's lots of other things going on right now with the pandemic, and lots of other things more focused on. But even in times where that's not only going to get a certain small percentage of folks that will come out to meetings and voice their concerns. And so the question is, what can you do about it? And I think that we can think through that with the city and the staff and the community development board, and trying to figure out how do reviews happen now, and are there ways that the city could improve and make progress toward hearing from more people. I don't know if other folks on the panel want to tackle that one, or if you think I did an okay job. Okay. All right. Okay. Anything else?
There was another question that I could answer. It was pertaining to the existing inventory. Let's see if I can find that. I had Annie Streetman, our land use planner, crunching some numbers for me so that I have these. And basically on our SHI, we have 1,699 are rental and 27 are ownership. And regarding the expiration dates, 949 units are affordable in perpetuity, 54 expire before 2030, 219 expire sometime between 2030 and 2040, 468 expire between 2040 and 2050, and one expires in 2050 to 2060. And then there's 35 that say not applicable because they're anonymous group homes. Regarding the income for those units, I would have to look into those. So if you shoot me your email, I'm d.evans@medfordma.gov. I'm happy to look into that to answer your question. And I believe the other part of your question was about oversight. So basically the subsidizing entity are the folks that would be monitoring the affordable units. For the local action, for the local action units, that would be the city. And so there's a variety of ways that we do that. You can do that in-house, or you can contract it out. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is kind of make it more organized, and that's reaching out to the different the different developments and asking for different information regarding the rents being paid, whether they're still income eligible, and reporting these to DHCD every year. And for the ownership, verifying that it's still their principal residence.
All right, I am looking and I'm not seeing new questions. I'm actually seeing a bunch of people dropping off now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of you being here. This was, I'm new to running a webinar, so I'm glad that it went pretty well. Any other closing thoughts, Alicia or Danielle or Anna?
I want to thank everybody for coming and staying with us this long, and we are going to upload this so that it can be viewable by others. It'll probably take us a few days to get it, but then we will be linking it from our website. And I'm going to ask some of, I think at least one of our interns is still watching as well, to remind me to make sure it gets posted to social media too once it's available. Thanks.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.